The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary silence of a chamber waiting to fill with argument and procedure. This was a different kind. This was the silence of 200 alien delegates holding their breath at the same time, without deciding to. I had been a human representative on the Galactic Council for 3 years. I had sat through budget disputes that lasted 11 days. I had listened to species argue over the exact wording of a trade clause for so long that 2 of their ambassadors had to be medically rotated out. I had never, not once, seen the chamber go quiet like this. I looked up from my notes and saw them. There were 4 of them standing at the entrance to the grand hall of the convocation. They wore no insignia. They carried no weapons. They did not announce themselves with ceremony or sound. They simply walked in, and every species in that room that had been alive long enough to know history went completely still. My name is Mira Osei. I am a diplomat by training, a reader by habit, and a human by the accident of birth on a planet called Earth. I say that last part because, in the 3 years I had served on this council, I had come to understand that being human meant something very specific in this galaxy. It meant being new. It meant being small. It meant being the species that had shown up only 60 years ago with no galactic allies, no ancient bloodlines, no seat at any table that mattered, and had somehow talked its way into this chamber, through a combination of persistence, legal argument, and the fact that we had built a faster-than-light relay station in disputed space before anyone could stop us. We were tolerated here. That was the honest word for it. Tolerated. But the 4 beings who walked into that chamber were not tolerated anywhere. They were something else entirely. The elders were not a species in the way the council understood species. They were not one bloodline or one planet. They were the oldest living representatives of the oldest surviving civilizations in the known galaxy, beings who had been present before the current galactic order existed, before the council existed, before most of the species in this room had learned to build fire. They appeared so rarely that the council's own records only showed 3 previous appearances in the last 4,000 years. Each of those appearances had preceded a significant change in galactic history. I watched the head of the council, a tall blue-gray Vethian named Councillor Orath, rise slowly from his seat. His voice, when it came, was careful. "We are honored by your presence," he said. "We were not informed of your arrival." The tallest of the 4 elders, a being whose skin moved like deep water under light, stepped forward. When it spoke, the translation came through our earpieces in flat, clean words, but behind the words there was something that pulled at the chest. Not a threat. Something older than a threat. "We do not inform," it said. "We arrive when arrival is necessary." No one laughed. No one spoke. 200 delegates of the most powerful species in the known galaxy sat perfectly still and listened. "We are here," the elder said, "because a mistake is being considered. We have seen this mistake before." It ends the same way each time, and so we have come to offer the council a single warning before the choice is made. Orath's long fingers pressed flat against the table. "What warning?" "Stop provoking humanity," the elder said. It is already too late to stop them. But if you move against them now, you will not survive the response. The chamber absorbed that for exactly 3 seconds. Then the noise came back. It did not come back gradually. It came back all at once, like water rushing into a broken hull. Delegates from the Vethian bloc started talking over the Ranthari representatives. The collective of Sorn began broadcasting their objections on the open channel before the floor was even recognized. I sat in my small human seat in the corner of the chamber where humanity had been assigned its space, and I watched 200 species react to the idea that they should be afraid of us. Most of them were laughing. Not cruelly, or not entirely. Some of it was genuine disbelief. Humanity had been in the galaxy for 60 years. We had one colony beyond our home system. We had a fleet of 12 ships, none of which were classified as military vessels under galactic definitions. We had no ancient allies, no claim to any resource that the major powers wanted badly enough to care about. We were, by every measurable standard the Council used, a minor species in the early stages of development. The idea that the Elders had crossed the dark between stars to warn the galaxy about us was, to most of the chamber, a kind of joke. I did not laugh. I had been watching the Elders since they walked in, and none of them had moved. Not to respond to the noise, not to show irritation, not to repeat themselves. They stood in the same positions they had taken when they entered, and they waited. There was something in that waiting that I could not name. I had spent my career reading rooms, reading people, reading the small signals that told you what someone actually meant underneath the words they were saying. I was good at it. It was the only reason I had the job I had. What I read in those 4 beings was not impatience. It was not offense. It was something that felt, and I know this sounds strange, like grief. Counselor Orath raised his hand for quiet. It took a long time. When the chamber finally settled, he turned back to the Elders. "The Council thanks you for your concern," he said, and even I could hear the careful diplomacy wrapping around the dismissal. "Humanity has been a member of this body for 3 years. They are developing well, within the expected parameters for a young species. There is no provocation occurring. The sanctions currently in discussion are a standard regulatory response to their unauthorized relay station." The Elder looked at him for a long moment. "You have heard us," it said. "That is enough." And they left. Just like that. No argument. No elaboration. They walked out the same way they had walked in, and the door closed behind them, and the chamber immediately erupted again with all the noise and motion that the galaxy's most powerful species could produce when they were busy not being afraid. I sat in my corner and wrote one line in my notes. It said, "They did not try to convince anyone." I kept staring at that line for the rest of the session. I had spent 3 years learning how this council worked. I had watched species argue, bribe, threaten, charm, deceive, and occasionally break into physical confrontation over policy decisions. I had watched every form of persuasion the galaxy had invented. And the Elders, who were the oldest beings alive, who had traveled to this chamber without announcement, to deliver a warning to 200 of the most powerful civilizations in existence, had not tried even once to make anyone believe them. They had said what they came to say, and then they had walked away. The sanctions against humanity passed that afternoon. The vote was not close. Trade restrictions, exclusion from military intelligence channels, a freeze on any new relay station permits. The Ranthari bloc pushed for a full territorial limitation order, which would have confined human expansion to a defined radius around Earth. But it failed by a narrow margin. I transmitted the full record back to Earth as required. I filed the procedural reports. I attended the formal closing session and shook the appropriate hands. I did my job with the exact professional steadiness that the job required. But that night, alone in my quarters on the council station, I opened the historical archive on my personal terminal and searched for one thing. I searched for every previous occasion when the Elders had appeared before the Galactic Council. I started with the oldest one and began to read. By the time the station lights cycled to their dim night setting, I had not moved from my chair. My tea had gone cold. My dinner notification had come and gone without me noticing. I had found something in those 3 records that no one in that chamber had apparently thought to look for. Each time the elders had appeared, they had issued a warning about a species. Each time, the council had dismissed the warning. Each time, within the following century, the species being warned about had come to dominate that era of galactic history so completely. Permanently reshaped around them. The elders were 3 for 3. I sat in the dark with that fact and felt something cold move through me. Not fear. Exactly. Something more precise than fear. The feeling you get when you suddenly understand that a game you thought you were winning has already ended, and the other player is simply being polite about it. I thought about the elder standing in the chamber. That still, that face that looked, more than anything else, like someone watching a choice being made, that they already knew the outcome of. I thought about what they had actually said. Not, humanity will become powerful. Not, humanity will defeat you. They had said, it is already too late to stop them. Past tense. I got up from my chair very slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there was Earth. Somewhere out there were 12 small ships and 1 unauthorized relay station, and 60 years of being the smallest species in the room. And somewhere in the galaxy, very quietly, something was already finished. The archives did not give up their secrets easily. That was the first thing I learned in the weeks after the elders left. The Galactic Council kept records going back 11,000 years, and those records were meticulous in the way that only institutions built by multiple civilizations over long stretches of time could be. Every vote, every treaty, every dispute, every discovery was catalogued with the kind of thoroughness that made the archive simultaneously the most complete historical record in existence and almost completely impossible to search usefully. I requested formal access to the restricted elder documents 3 times through proper channels. 3 times I was told the request was under review. On the 4th request I added a procedural note citing Section 12 of the Council's Transparency Covenant, which required that any document more than 300 years old be made accessible to sitting representatives upon written application. The response came back within 2 hours and contained a new access code. I did not sleep much that week. My name was still Mira Osei. I was still a human diplomat, with a small office in the corner of the council station that smelled faintly of recycled air and whatever cleaning solution the maintenance crew used on the floors. And mildly irritating at worst. None of that had changed. What had changed was what I was looking for. The 3 previous elder appearances were well documented in the public archive, but the restricted files added something the public record did not have. They added the council's internal assessment documents, the private deliberations, the memos that were never meant to be read by outsiders. The first appearance, roughly 4,000 years ago, had concerned a species called the Verath Sol. They were a mid-tier civilization at the time, not especially notable, with a modest fleet and a handful of colony worlds. The elders had come to warn the council about them. The council had reviewed the situation and concluded that the Verath Sol posed no meaningful threat. The internal assessment described them as a species with, quote, no demonstrated capacity for large-scale coordination and no strategic ambition beyond their immediate neighborhood, end quote. Within 300 years, the Verath Sol had become the civilization that the Ranthari, the Vethians, and the Sorn had all evolved from. They were not a species anymore. They were the foundation of the current galactic order. Every major power in the Council today could trace some part of their institutional development back to Verath Sol influence. The second appearance, roughly 2,000 years ago, had concerned a species the archive called the Holith Compact. Again, the elders came. Again, the council listened politely and did nothing. The internal notes described the Holith Compact as a, quote, inward-facing civilization, unlikely to project significant power beyond their current holdings, end quote. The Holith Compact had subsequently developed the Jumpgate network that made modern, faster-than-light travel possible. Every ship in the galaxy, including every council patrol vessel, used a version of their technology. The third appearance was only 800 years ago. I read those files 3 times because the species being warned about was not familiar to me under any name I recognized. The elder warning had been issued about what the records called the Marin. economically integrated but militarily negligible. End quote. In a footnote of a trade agreement update from 600 years ago, the Marin had dissolved themselves voluntarily. They had integrated so completely into the infrastructure and economic systems of 15 other civilizations that they had simply stopped existing as a separate entity. They were everywhere. Their genetic lines, their technologies, their administrative methods, they were the water the current council swam in without ever thinking about water. They had not conquered anyone. They had become necessary to everyone. I sat back from my terminal and closed my eyes. The pattern was not what I had expected. I had gone into those files expecting to find stories of military victory, of species that rose up and fought their way to power after being underestimated. That would have been a straightforward story. Underdog wins in the end. I could have understood that. This was not that. Every species the elders had warned about had become dominant not by fighting but by becoming indispensable. The Varath Sol had built the cultural and philosophical frameworks that the current great powers had built their identities on. The Holith Compact had built the roads. The Marin had built themselves into the walls. And in every case, by the time the council realized what was happening, the process was so far along that reversing it would have required the Galactic Order to collapse itself. I opened a new document and sat for a long time without typing anything. Then I typed, "What has humanity been doing for the last 17 years?" This required more care than the archive search. The public record on human activity was not restricted, but it was scattered across dozens of different reporting systems. In so many different sectors, we had no single military database to pull from, no central fleet registry that would give me a clean picture. What we had was commercial filings, infrastructure permits, medical partnership agreements, research collaboration records, communications relay contracts. I started pulling those files. It took 4 days. I barely left my office. I answered the routine council messages that required a response, and ignored the rest. It was not the picture I had expected, and I had already stopped expecting comfortable pictures by then. Human engineers had filed infrastructure contracts in 22 star systems over the past 17 years. Not military contracts. Infrastructure, power grid maintenance, water reclamation system upgrades for colony worlds, communications relay construction and maintenance. The work was quiet, unglamorous, and spread across systems that the major powers considered too small to prioritize with their own resources. Human medical teams had established partnership agreements with 17 different civilizations, providing staffing for remote colony clinics in exchange for operating rights and a small monthly data sharing arrangement. The data being shared was described in the agreements as, quote, general health and population metrics for research purposes. Human scientists had published collaborative research with 41 different institutions across 30 species. The research was in fields that sounded unremarkable, until you looked at them together. Power systems, communications infrastructure, environmental maintenance, supply chain logistics. There was a word for what I was looking at. The word was presence. Human beings had spent 17 years becoming present in every system that mattered for keeping the galactic economy running. Not loudly, not with flags or speeches or news coverage. Quietly, professionally. Offering services that other species found useful, making themselves easy to work with, filing the right permits, following the local regulations, showing up on time and doing good work. And now they were everywhere. I pulled up the communications relay network map and overlaid it with the human infrastructure contract database. The result made me put my hand over my mouth. 43% of the communications relay stations in the outer spiral were built, maintained, or operated by humans or by companies with primary human ownership. In the mid-spiral, where most of the Council's major systems were located, the number dropped to 19%. But 19% of the mid-spiral communications network was not a small number. It was a critical number. It was the number where, if those stations went offline simultaneously, the Council's ability to coordinate a military response to anything would be significantly degraded. %11 of outer spiral power infrastructure, 8% of mid-spiral backup systems. 31 colony worlds with primary medical staffing provided by humans. Each number individually was manageable. Each number individually looked like what it was described as. A developing species, finding its economic niche, doing useful work, building relationships. Together they looked like something else. Together they looked like a plan. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my quarters and stared at the ceiling and thought about a species that had been sanctioned, excluded from military channels, denied expansion permits, and relegated to a corner seat in the council chamber. A species that had responded to all of that not with anger, not with demands, not with any of the behaviors that the council would have recognized and known how to respond to. A species that had simply gone to work. The elder's words came back to me in the dark. It is already too late to stop them. I thought I was beginning to understand what those words meant, but I still did not understand the last part of the sentence that the elder had not spoken. I did not understand what stopping humanity would have meant, what the thing they were doing was building toward. I was still missing the answer to the most important question. Not what humanity had done, but what humanity had done. I presented my findings to no one. This was not a decision I made lightly. I was a council representative. I had a responsibility to report material information that affected the council's decisions. That responsibility was written into my appointment terms, and I had signed those terms. And I was not a person who signed things without meaning them, but I sat with my files for 2 full days before I did anything, because I needed to understand what I was looking at before I put it in front of people who would react to it without understanding it. The council's first response to information they did not understand was to restrict it. Their second response was to act on it before they had time to think. I had watched this pattern play out enough times to trust it, so I thought first. Human beings had spent 17 years building infrastructure presence across a significant portion of the galactic network. They had done it legally, through proper channels, with correct permits and compliant contracts. Every single arrangement I had found in the files was documented, transparent, and technically above board. There was nothing to sanction. There was nothing to reverse on legal grounds. A species was allowed to bid on infrastructure contracts. A species was allowed to partner with medical institutions. A species was allowed to publish research. There was nothing illegal about becoming important. What I needed to understand was whether there was a purpose behind it beyond what it looked like. On the surface, the pattern in the archive suggested there was. The Verath Sol, the Holith Compact, the Marin. Each of them had built towards something, but the something was different in each case. I needed to know what humanity was building toward. To find that out, I needed to talk to a human. I had one direct contact in the human government that I trusted to give me a straight answer. His name was Callum Park, and he was not a diplomat. He was an engineer who had spent the past decade managing human infrastructure operations in the outer spiral. We had met at a technical conference 2 years before, and stayed in contact because he was one of the few people I had found in my career who spoke the same way about problems that I did. He said what he meant. and he meant what he said. I sent him a message on the personal channel we used for non-official communication. I have been looking at the infrastructure records. I want to understand what I am looking at. Can you speak? I was wondering when you would find those. We spoke for a long time. Because some of what Callum told me in that call was not mine to put in a report. But I will say that what he described was not a secret plan. It was not a hidden agenda designed by some shadowy human government committee. It was an agreement. Not a formal treaty, not a signed document. An agreement. In the way that a community agrees on something, without ever sitting down to vote on it. A shared understanding that had emerged, he said, in the years after humanity's first decade on the Council, when it became clear that the Council was not going to take humans seriously, and that the sanctions and the exclusions and the corner seat were not temporary inconveniences, but the permanent shape of the relationship. At some point, Callum said, enough humans had the same conversation with enough other humans, and the conclusion was always the same. We could not fight our way to a seat at the table. We were too small and too new, and the table was held by people who had been sitting at it for thousands of years. We could not charm our way there. We were too strange and too young and too different for that to work either. We could not buy our way there because we did not have enough of anything that they wanted. But we could become necessary. Not threatening, not powerful in the way they understood power. Necessary in the quiet, operational way that the people who fix things are necessary. The engineers who keep the lights on. The doctors who staff the clinics at the edge of nowhere. The relay station operators who make sure the signal gets through. None of those people are famous. None of them are feared. But every civilization in the galaxy depends on people like them to keep running. And when those people are all from the same place, that place becomes very difficult to simply remove. Callum was quiet for a moment after he said that. Then he said, we were not trying to take anything. We were trying to not be removable. I asked him how far along it was. He was quiet for a longer moment. Then he told me to pull up the outer spiral relay network and count the green indicators. Green meant operational, maintained within the last 30 days. I pulled it up. I counted. Then I understood why the elders had looked the way they looked when they walked out of the council chamber. They were not grieving for humanity. They were grieving for everyone else. The sanctions the council had voted through continued to be implemented over the following weeks. The trade restrictions began affecting human commercial operations in 6 systems. Human representatives in 3 border zones were informed that their infrastructure contracts were under review, pending a new council regulatory framework that was being drafted. I watched those notifications go out through official channels and I thought, they do not know. The council had spent 3 years watching humanity with half their attention, the way you watch something that is not important enough to watch fully. They had seen a small new species doing small new species things. They had not seen the shape of what those things added up to. Now there was a new regulatory framework coming. Now there were infrastructure contract reviews. Now there were real people inside the human government, reading official council notices and understanding what those notices meant. I did not know exactly what would happen next. I want to be honest about that. I had the archive data, and I had my conversation with Callum, and I had the pattern I had found in 3 previous elder warnings, but I did not have access to human government internal planning. I did not know the specifics. What I knew was the shape. And the shape was, the council had moved, and the elders had said that moving was the thing they should not do. The council's regulatory review notice went out on a Tuesday. I know this because I was in the chamber when the administrative coordinator sent the batch transmission, and I watched the timestamp appear on the formal record. For 6 days, nothing happened. The council interpreted this as compliance. Several delegates made comments in informal sessions about how the regulatory review was proceeding smoothly. Councillor Orath said in a corridor conversation that I was present for that he thought the whole elder situation had been overblown, that humanity was, quote, a practical species that understood how things worked. I was sitting in my office when the first alert came through on the station's infrastructure monitoring system. It was a communications relay indicator in the outer spiral. Station 7 in the Quran belt. Offline. I noted it and kept working. 3 minutes later, another alert. Station 12, also in the outer spiral. Offline. I stood up from my desk. Over the next 40 minutes, I watched the monitoring board light up in a pattern that I recognized before the council operations team did, because I had been looking at the infrastructure map for weeks. Every station that had gone offline was a human-operated, point. By the time the operations team called an emergency session, 17 star systems had gone dark. Not dark as in destroyed. Dark as in disconnected. The power was still on. The hardware was still intact. The relays were simply not transmitting, and the teams responsible for maintaining them were not responding to council communications, because the council communications were traveling through relays that were offline. I sat in the emergency session and watched some of the most powerful species in the galaxy encounter something they had no procedure for. Not an attack. A pause. Counselor Orath was trying to reach the outer spiral command post, and the signal was not getting through. And he could not understand why the backup channels were not working either, and someone was trying to explain to him that the backup channels for those systems routed through the same relay network, and he was asking why anyone had permitted that. And no one had a satisfying answer because the permits had been filed correctly and reviewed and approved, and no single permit had looked like anything other than a routine infrastructure operation. That was the moment I understood it completely. It had never been a secret. It had never needed to be a secret. Every contract was public. Every permit was on file. Every relay station and medical agreement and research partnership was documented and visible to anyone who wanted to look. But no one had ever put it all in the same picture at the same time, and asked what the picture meant. I had done that only because the elders had made me nervous enough to look. The emergency session was still running when the transmission came in from the human government. It came through one of the channels that was still operational. A mid-spiral relay that was not in the affected zone, and it arrived as a plain text communication, addressed to the full council. I read it on the chamber screen with everyone else. It was short. It said, "We are aware of the current communication disruptions in affected zones. These disruptions are a result of scheduled maintenance being paused pending clarification of our operational status under the new regulatory framework. We have no desire for conflict. We have never had any desire for conflict. We are prepared to restore full operational service immediately upon the following conditions: withdrawal of the current trade restrictions, reinstatement of the expansion permits frozen in the previous council session, and formal acknowledgement of humanity's right to participate in infrastructure contracting under the same terms as any member species. We do not issue ultimatums. We are simply clarifying that our teams cannot be expected to maintain systems, while their legal right to operate those systems is under formal review. We look forward to a resolution." The chamber was very quiet. I thought about the elders standing in that same room. That still, patient posture. The grief I had read in their stillness. I thought about 3 previous species, 3 previous warnings, 3 previous outcomes. And I thought about Callum's words. We were not trying to take anything. We were trying to not be removable. Somewhere in 17 dark star systems, human maintenance teams were sitting quietly, with their work paused, waiting. No weapons. No demands beyond what had already been taken from them. No army at the gate. Just 17 systems in the dark. And a politely worded message, and the patience of a species that had been practicing patience for 17 years. The Council had 36 hours to respond before the outer spiral medical stations began routing their emergency communications through the backup channels, which also ran through the same relay network. I watched Councillor Orath read the transmission a second time, and then a third. He looked, for the first time since I had known him, like a person who was not sure what to do next. I want to describe what 36 hours of a galactic power structure deciding whether to give ground actually looks like. Most people imagine it as dramatic. Raised voices, threats, declarations. I had imagined something like that myself, somewhere in the back of my mind, in the part that had grown up watching political stories where the turning point was always a confrontation. It was not like that. It was exhausting in the way that only bureaucracies under pressure can be exhausting. It was a series of emergency sessions that each ran too long and produced too little. It was delegates who were accustomed to having time going through the strange experience of not having time, and finding that they did not know how to think quickly when the situation required it. I was in the chamber for most of it. I was still, technically, the human representative. My presence was something of an awkwardness for everyone, including me. The Council had just received a message from my government that had the flavor of a firm negotiating position, and I was sitting in my assigned seat in the corner with my notepad and my professional expression, and no one was quite sure how to talk to me. I did not try to make it easier for them. That was not my job at that moment. My job was to be present, and to observe, and to report, and I did all 3. The first 6 hours were spent trying to find a technical solution. Could the Council restore the relay stations without human cooperation? Several engineering teams were dispatched to assess. They came back with reports that the relay hardware was intact but required access credentials for the operational systems, and those credentials were held by the contracted operators, and the contracted operators were human. There were procedures for emergency credential transfer, but those procedures required the cooperation of the original operator, or a legal order. And a legal order would take longer than 36 hours to process through the Council's own court system. The second 6 hours were spent arguing about whether to simply take the stations by force and assign new operators. This argument was lengthy and, to my professional eye, had the character of an argument that people are making because they need to feel like they are doing something rather than because they have a good option. Simultaneously would require deploying a significant portion of the Council's available patrol fleet. The patrol fleet deployment would take at minimum 48 hours to coordinate, which was longer than the medical emergency window. Also, and this was the part that I watched several delegates struggle with, There was the question of what the formal justification for a military seizure of legally contracted infrastructure would look like in the council record. The contracts were valid. They had paused maintenance. They had not sabotaged anything. Sending a fleet to take stations from a species that had, on paper, done nothing except stop working while their legal status was under review, was an action that several of the council's own legal advisors were describing in increasingly uncomfortable terms. Regulatory review had been poorly timed, and suggest a temporary suspension of the review process. This was the argument that sounded like giving ground, and it produced the most noise in the chamber, because sounding like you were giving ground to humanity was something that several bloc leaders had strong feelings about. I listened to those feelings being expressed at some length. I thought about the archive. I thought about the Varath Sol and the Holith Compact and the Marin. I thought about how none of those species had needed the council to feel good about the outcome. By hour 20, the medical emergency reports started coming in from 3 colony worlds in the outer spiral. Not catastrophic situations. The colony medical teams were managing, but the emergency communications were routing through backup channels that added significant delay, and there were 2 situations that the colony administrators were flagging as potentially serious if the delay continued. The chamber read those reports in a silence that had a different quality than the earlier silences. This was the silence of people beginning to understand the difference between an abstract argument about power and a concrete situation involving people who needed help. Councillor Orath called a closed session of the senior bloc representatives. I was not invited to that session, which was correct procedure. I was human. My presence would have been a conflict of interest. I went back to my office and sat at my desk and waited. The closed session lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the formal resolution was transmitted to all member representatives simultaneously. I read it on my terminal. The trade restrictions against humanity were suspended pending a formal review with human government participation. The expansion permit freeze was lifted. The infrastructure contract review was paused. The Council formally acknowledged humanity's right to participate in all standard contracting processes under the same terms as established member species. In return, the human government was requested to restore relay operations as soon as possible. The human government's response arrived 11 minutes later. It said, "Acknowledged." Maintenance teams are being dispatched now. Full service will be restored within 6 hours. We appreciate the Council's attention to this matter. The stars in 17 systems lit back up. I was standing at my office window when it happened, watching the monitoring board shift from amber to green system by system, and I felt something that I did not entirely know how to describe. It was not triumph, it was closer to the feeling you get when you have been holding your breath without realizing it, and you finally let it out. The next morning I sent a message to Callum. I told him the restoration was complete. I asked if he was doing well. He responded with 3 words. He said, "Lights are on." 3 days after the relay stations were restored, the elders appeared again. There was no announcement. There was no ceremony. The chamber was in the middle of a routine agricultural subsidy debate. When the four of them walked in through the same entrance they had used before, the room went silent the same way it had the first time. They walked to the center of the floor, and the tallest one, the one whose skin moved like water, looked around the chamber for a moment. Then it looked directly at me, which was the only time in either of their appearances that an elder had made direct eye contact with any specific delegate, and I felt the full weight of that attention land on me like something physical. Then it looked away and addressed the room. "You have chosen well," it said. "We have not always been able to say that." No one spoke. "We grieve for what you do not yet understand," it continued. "The species you moved against was never your threat. What they have done here, they will continue to do. Not against you. For you. In the way that a foundation is for the building above it. You did not know you were building on them. Now you do." Counselor Orath, with what I thought was genuine difficulty, found his voice. "What should we have done differently?" he asked. The elder looked at him. "You should have listened the first time," it said. And then they left again. The chamber sat in silence for a long time after the door closed. Longer than the first time. I watched delegates who had laughed the first time sit with expressions I did not have words for. I did not write anything in my notes during that silence. I just sat. The formal record would say that the crisis lasted 36 hours, that a diplomatic resolution was reached, and that normal operations were restored. The formal record would be accurate. It would also be incomplete in the way that formal records are always incomplete, because what actually happened in those 36 hours was not primarily a crisis. It was a lesson. And the lesson had been a long time coming. I spent the weeks after the second elder appearance doing something I had not done before in my time on the council. I started talking to people honestly. Not in the careful, measured way of a diplomat calculating each sentence before it left my mouth. I mean honestly. The way you talk when you have decided that the performance of diplomacy is less important than the thing you are actually trying to accomplish. I talked to Counselor Orath first. We met in his private office, just the two of us, without aides or recorders. He was quieter than I had ever seen him. The enormous blue-gray authority he carried into every session he ran was still there, but it was sitting differently on him, like a garment that had shifted slightly out of place, and he was aware of it. I told him what I had found in the archive. The Varath Sol, the Holith Compact, the Marin. I walked him through the pattern the same way I had worked through it myself. Carefully, one piece at a time. He did not interrupt me. When I finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "Why did no one find this before?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said, "Because the elder warnings were in the archive as curiosities, not as data. They were filed under historical events, not under policy analysis. And because, when the elders appeared, the council spent its attention on responding to the unusual nature of the appearance, rather than on taking the content of the warning seriously. Everyone was reacting to how strange it was that the elders had come at all. No one was listening to what they actually said. Orath was quiet again. Then he said, "And no one listened to what they said because the subject of the warning was humanity." I said yes. He did not say anything else for a while. "I waited," he said finally. "We did not believe a new species could matter that much." That is exactly what the council said about the Varath Sol, and the Holith Compact, and the Marin. He looked at me with an expression that I had not seen on him before. It was, I think, the expression of a person who has just understood something they cannot unknow. My conversations with the other block leaders were harder. Some of them were angry, in the way that people are angry when they feel they have been made to look foolish, and that anger looked for somewhere to direct itself. Several of them suggested, in varying degrees of thinly veiled language, that humanity had acted improperly, that pausing maintenance on contracted infrastructure was a form of coercion, that the situation should be reviewed by the legal committee. I let them say what they needed to say. Then I pointed out calmly that every maintenance pause had been procedurally justified by the contract review that the council itself had initiated, that humanity had sent a clear communication explaining the situation and requesting a resolution, that no infrastructure had been damaged, no service had been disrupted beyond the maintenance pause, and no threat had been issued. What humanity had done was exercise a contractor's right to pause work while their contract status was under formal dispute. If you find that objectionable, I would encourage you to review how many of your own infrastructure contracts contain similar clauses. I think you will find the number is significant. Several of those conversations ended earlier than expected. The hardest conversation was the one I had with myself, alone in my office on a night about 3 weeks after the relays came back on. I had been a diplomat for 15 years. I had spent my career representing humanity in rooms where humanity was not taken seriously, and I had done it with patience and professionalism and the quiet determination that the job required. In the way that people believe things when they have decided that believing them is necessary to do the work, that the path forward for humanity in the galactic order was the slow, careful, legitimate one. demonstrate value through proper channels. Wait, I had been right about all of that. But sitting in that office, looking at the green indicators on the relay map that represented something humanity had built over 17 years without anyone noticing until it was already built, I understood something about patience that I had not fully understood before. Patience is not simply waiting. Patience is waiting while working. Patience is having a very long view of time, and filling all of that time with deliberate, purposeful motion. Patience is what you practice when you understand that the outcomes you want are real and achievable but not near, and that trying to rush them will only break them. And here was the thing that I had not let myself sit with fully until that night. The thing that made my chest feel tight in a way that was not entirely comfortable. We had won. Not won as in defeated someone. Won as in the outcome we had been working toward. The outcome of being present and necessary and impossible to simply discard. That outcome was now real. The council had acknowledged our rights. The sanctions were suspended. The contracts were intact. Humanity was still in every system where it had built itself over the past 17 years. And it was not leaving. And everyone in the galaxy now knew that asking it to leave had a cost that the asker would feel immediately and personally. We had not fired a single weapon. We had not threatened a single life. We had simply stopped working for 36 hours. And the most powerful political body in the known galaxy had changed its position. That was not a small thing. It was not a comfortable thing either. Because winning meant that the dynamic had changed, and changed dynamics always meant someone had lost ground, and lost ground always meant complicated feelings that took a long time to settle into something workable. Humanity had a lot of conversations ahead of it. But we had time. That was the other thing I understood that night. We had time in a way we had not had before. Because we had made ourselves difficult to remove. And difficult to remove meant the conversations would happen on terms where we had standing. Where our seat was not a corner tolerance but an actual position. I thought about Callum and his maintenance teams, dispersed across the outer spiral, doing the quiet work of keeping things running. I thought about the medical teams on 31 colony worlds, showing up every day in the clinics at the edge of nowhere where no one else wanted to go. I thought about 17 years of humans showing up on time, and filing the right permits, and doing good work, and building something that looked, from the outside, like nothing in particular, until the day it looked like everything. The elder had said, "What they have done here, they will continue to do. Not against you. For you." I believed that. I had always believed that. The goal was never to win against the Council. The goal was to build a galaxy where humanity had a place, and where that place mattered, and where the work we did was genuinely useful to the civilizations around us. We had not achieved that goal. Not fully. One crisis resolved is not a relationship rebuilt. One suspended sanction is not genuine respect. And we were not alone on it anymore. Because now the Council knew we were there. Really knew. Not as a minor species in a corner seat that could be ignored. As the people who kept the lights on in 17 star systems and who had chosen, when given reason to stop, to pause their work politely, and send a message that asked for fairness, instead of reaching for something worse. That choice mattered. I knew it mattered not because it looked impressive, but because of what it said about who we were. The power to hurt, and the choice not to use it. The request for what was fair, instead of the reach for what could be taken. That combination was the thing that made the elders grieve. Not because humanity was frightening, because humanity was ready. I stood at my window for a long time that night, looking out at the stars the way I had on the night after the first elder appearance. Then, I had been afraid and uncertain, and trying to understand something I did not yet have the pieces to see clearly. Now, I had the pieces. They were not all comfortable pieces. The shape they made was not a simple shape. But it was real, and it was ours, and it had been built by thousands of ordinary people doing unglamorous work in distant places, because they believed in something longer than their own lifetimes. I thought about what the elder had said in its second appearance. They should have listened the first time. I thought the elder was right, but I also thought, they listened now. That was not nothing. That was, in its own imperfect way, a beginning. I turned off my office light and went to bed. And somewhere in the outer spiral, in 17 systems that had been dark for 36 hours, and were now burning steady and bright, human maintenance teams checked their boards, confirmed green on all indicators, and logged another ordinary night of keeping the galaxy running. The way they had always done it. The way they would keep doing it. Quietly, steadily, and for a very long time.